What if I told you that the modern corporate boardroom, the ancient Spartan military, and like a medieval cult of assassins all rely on the exact same psychological glitch to control human behavior?
It sounds totally bizarre when you put it like that.
Right. But welcome to this deep dive, because whether you were trying to understand the dizzying mechanics of global economics or you're just insanely curious about how human behavior is manipulated on a mass scale, you are really going to want to stick around for this.
Yeah, we are promising you some serious aha moments today.
Absolutely. So what are we looking at today?
Well, we're diving into a really fascinating YouTube lecture transcript from the channel Yang Perspectiva. It's titled El Simbolismo en la Política y el Poder Global, which translates to Symbolism in Politics and Global Power.
And it is dense.
Oh, very. The source material takes this sweeping, highly detailed look at history to try and decode how authority actually operates behind the scenes.
Yeah. And our mission today is ambitious, honestly.
Yeah.
We are going to map the hidden architecture of global power.
A light afternoon topic, right?
Super light. We're going to trace how ancient psychological control tactics sort of merged with secret societies and how that bizarre marriage eventually birthed the modern transnational financial systems that you and I live under right now.
It's a huge journey.
It is. Okay, let's unpack this. Where do we even begin to look for the foundation of global power?
Well, we have to start with the human mind. I mean, to understand how global power operates, you first have to understand the actual mechanics of obedience. Like, why do we obey in the first place?
Right.
So the source material takes us all the way back to mythology, specifically to the Roman god Saturn, who is, known in Greek mythology as Kronos, the god of time and structure.
And his method for maintaining that structure was, well, incredibly extreme.
To say the least, yeah.
According to the myth, Kronos literally ate his own children to prevent them from rebelling against him and usurping his power.
Yeah, and the lecture points out that in many covert organizations and secret societies, there's actually a deep reverence for this exact archetypal energy.
Wait, really? Eating your kids?
Well, no, not literally, but they seek to channel that ruthless, consuming authority to maintain order. The historical justification is basically always that a select few must bear the burden of control.
Right, doing whatever it takes.
Exactly, doing whatever it takes to keep the masses from destroying themselves. It's a deeply paternalistic, absolute authority that claims to be operating for the greater good. But building that kind of societal structure requires absolute, unquestioning conformity.
Which brings up a foundational psychological concept that was highlighted in the source, the Solomon Asch experiment.
Yes, such a classic study.
For those listening who might not have taken Psych 101 recently, imagine you are sitting in a room with a group of people. You're shown a picture of a line and then a picture of 3 other lines, and you just have to say which one matches the first line out loud.
And it is blindingly obvious, like it's an objective visual task.
Completely obvious. But here's the catch. Everyone else in the room is an actor, and they all confidently pick the completely wrong line.
So when it's your turn to answer, the pressure of the group consensus is so overwhelming that a staggering number of participants will actually agree with the group.
They just cave.
They totally cave. They will deny their own clear perception. The experiment basically proves that conformity and the pressure of authority can fundamentally overwrite an individual's reality.
I always think about that in the context of modern corporate culture.
Oh, for sure.
You're in a boardroom, the CEO pitches a terrible idea, and one by one, everyone just nods along. No one wants to be the one to disagree with the consensus. It's that exact same conformity impulse. But I have to push back here a little.
Okay, go for it.
Conformity in a meeting is one thing, right? And falling to peer pressure in a lab setting is another. But how does a small elite group actually enforce this kind of extreme psychological control over entire generations?
Yeah.
I mean, human nature naturally rebels against oppression eventually, doesn't it?
Well, what's fascinating here is how the source answers that exact question. The mechanism they use is trauma. Yeah. Trauma doesn't just oppress a victim. It actively binds the victim to the oppressor. It's the psychological phenomenon we commonly call Stockholm Syndrome.
Right.
When a person's reality is just shattered, and their basic survival becomes completely dependent on the very entity abusing them, the human brain generates this profound, irrational loyalty to the abuser. It's a survival mechanism.
But wait, Stockholm Syndrome happens to, isolated hostages locked in a bank vault. How on earth do you apply that psychological phenomenon to an entire civilization? You
Yeah.
can't kidnap millions of people and hold them hostage.
You don't have to kidnap them if you institutionalize the trauma from birth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look at ancient Sparta, which the source cites as an early blueprint for this. Children were separated from their parents at a very young age and subjected to deliberate systemic abuse and deprivation by the state.
Brutal conditions.
Incredibly brutal. And the whole goal was to forge soldiers whose only source of validation and survival was the military hierarchy. We see the exact same psychological mechanism in modern urban street gangs or, with child soldiers.
Right, the leaders combine horrific violence with selective, unpredictable care to generate absolute fidelity.
Exactly. The trauma essentially overwrites their individual identity.
And the most wild historical example the text provides is the assassins of the Middle Ages. The psychological engineering they used was terrifyingly precise.
Oh, the initiation rituals.
Yeah, when a new member was initiated, they were given powerful hallucinogens to completely cloud their perception of reality. In this altered state, they were brought into a lavish garden setting filled with immense physical pleasure.
Like a literal paradise.
Exactly. Then they were drugged again and returned to their harsh, normal reality.
And the master of the order would tell them they had just visited heaven, and if they followed orders absolutely, even if it meant dying on a mission, they would return to that paradise permanently.
It completely bypassed their rational mind.
Totally. The combination of trauma, sensory manipulation, and hallucinogens created the perfect executor. The text notes that this extreme psychological pressure causes the mind to basically dissociate. The victim literally cannot process the manipulation, allowing controllers to operate them almost like, remote control assets.
And the source connects this ancient practice directly to modern operations, specifically bringing up programs like MKUltra and MK Monarch.
Which is pretty chilling to think about.
Extremely. And for the listener, these were real declassified Cold War-era intelligence programs where agencies literally experimented with sensory deprivation, trauma, and psychedelics to see if they could fracture and reprogram a human mind.
They were essentially trying to mass-produce that assassin mechanism for modern espionage.
Right. But controlling individual minds or even programming a few loyal soldiers isn't enough to run the world. To scale this kind of control globally, you need something that millions of people will voluntarily participate in without realizing it.
You need a system.
Exactly. You need an inescapable economic system.
And that's where the source maps out how this desire for control transitioned geographically and economically. It went through 4 massive mercantile oligarchies: Venice, the Dutch Republic, England, and finally the United States.
And crucially, these empires weren't driven by kings believing they had a divine right to rule, right? Nor were they driven by democratic consensus.
No, not at all. They were driven entirely by private transnational capital.
The origin story of Venice alone is incredible. After the Roman Empire fell, Venice was essentially just a bunch of refugees living on a swamp.
A literal swamp.
They had absolutely zero natural resources. They couldn't farm. They had no mines to extract gold or iron. Yet they became a dominant global power. How do you conquer the world from a swamp?
Because they mastered the intangible. They realized that physical territory is really expensive to defend, but controlling the flow of commerce is immensely profitable. They survived and thrived purely through trade, piracy, and just relentless diplomacy. They built these vast commercial networks reaching across Europe and Asia, making really pragmatic alliances with the Islamic Empire, the Mongols, the bureaucrats in Constantinople.
So they weren't ideological at all.
No, they didn't care about ideological or religious purity. They cared exclusively about the velocity of capital.
It's so much like a modern tech startup. I mean, think about a massive ride-sharing app that doesn't actually own any cars, or a hospitality app that doesn't own any hotels.
That is a great analogy.
They dominate by owning the network. Venice had no physical assets of its own, but they built the platform that everyone else had to use.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, Venice also innovated how to handle financial risk. Local Venetian banks pioneered early forms of joint stock investments, which basically allowed wealthy merchants to pool their resources together for massive, highly dangerous maritime ventures.
So if one ship sank, no single merchant was ruined.
Exactly. This pooling of capital is the bedrock of the modern corporate structure. And the source identifies 3 specific tools these oligarchies use to maintain this network: banking, navies, and diplomacy.
Let's break down how those 3 tools actually function together as a system of control.
Well, it operates as a self-sustaining feedback loop. First, you have banking. And the text describes banking in a really profound way. It says it is the extraction of resources from the future.
Wow. Extracting from the future.
Yeah. By issuing debt, you basically pull future labor and wealth into the present. You then use that pooled wealth to build the second tool, which is navies.
To protect the investment.
Right. These massive fleets physically secure and monopolize global trade routes, ensuring those financial investments pay off. Finally, diplomacy. But a very specific, cynical kind of diplomacy. It's the art of manipulating conflicts so that rival nations fight and drain their own treasuries in proxy wars.
Why spend your own wealth fighting France or Spain when you can fund their enemies and watch them destroy each other?
Exactly. And your trade networks remain entirely untouched.
It's brilliant, but man, it is ruthless. And keeping this global network of private wealth coordinated obviously required a connective tissue that transcended national borders.
Right. They needed a way to talk.
That's where secret societies acting as quiet, cross-border intelligence networks come back into play. But here is the massive historical problem. If you are a ruthless mercantile oligarchy accumulating unprecedented amounts of wealth through global piracy and financial extraction, the peasants are eventually going to revolt.
Oh, inevitably.
You need a rock-solid PR strategy. You need the masses to believe that your immense wealth accumulation is not only fair, but morally righteous.
And to achieve that on a civilizational scale, you have to fundamentally alter the dominant theology. You essentially need to convince the public that the economic system is divinely ordained.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The source dives into how the Protestant Reformation was essentially utilized as an economic weapon. We're taught the Reformation was purely a religious debate sparked by Martin Luther.
Right, the 95 Theses on the door.
Exactly. But the text focuses heavily on John Calvin.
Yeah, John Calvin introduced the theological concept of double predestination. This is the belief that God has already determined before you're even born whether you are saved and going to heaven or damned to hell.
Which is bleak.
Very. There is absolutely nothing you can do, no good deeds you can perform to change your assigned fate.
Which is incredibly anxiety-inducing. I mean, if you can't earn your way to heaven by being a good person, how do you know if you're one of the chosen ones?
And that psychological anxiety is the brilliant and kind of terrifying twist that drove early capitalism. The theology evolved to suggest that the ultimate proof of God's favor was material success.
So making money meant you were saved.
Exactly. If you were wealthy and your business was thriving, it was a visible sign that God had blessed you. Poverty was suddenly framed not as a noble struggle, but as a literal sign of divine disfavor.
Wait, so deeply theological concepts like predestination were essentially co-opted as the ultimate marketing campaign for early corporate monopolies?
Functionally, yes. And the source impartially points out that this ideology perfectly incentivized the rise of the Dutch Republic. Governed by Calvinist merchants, they embraced the idea that accumulating massive capital was a literal divine mandate.
It fueled their incredible economic expansion.
It did. They actively pirated the wealth of the Spanish Catholic Empire, whose power was based on old nobility and clerical privilege, and poured that stolen capital into industry, shipbuilding, and luxury goods.
And reinvesting that capital birthed the Dutch East India Company.
Mm-hmm.
And we really need to clarify what that actually was, because we hear company and think of like a modern corporation selling software or something.
Right, like an office building.
Yeah, but the Dutch East India Company was an eponymous sovereign entity. It had its own military, it could mint its own currency, negotiate treaties, and declare wars. It had a total monopoly on the global spice trade. It was basically a state-sponsored pirate fleet with private shareholders.
And the Catholic Church suddenly found itself facing an existential threat. They were losing their monopoly on divine truth, which meant they were losing their financial monopoly over European tithes and sovereign debt.
Which led to huge conflict.
Right. This theological shift triggered horrific violence across the continent, culminating in the 30 Years' War. And out of this chaos, we see the rise of highly sophisticated religious intelligence networks fighting a covert war.
The source frames this as the Jesuits versus the Freemasons.
Yeah, the Catholic Church created the Jesuit order as an intellectual vanguard. They functioned essentially as a secret society dedicated to education and diplomacy, tasked with deeply infiltrating the aristocratic and educational systems of Protestant societies to reclaim influence from the inside out.
But the Protestants had a countermove, right?
Right. In response, Protestant mercantile elites utilized and expanded Masonic networks. These provided a secure, covert system of communication and mutual protection across borders to safeguard their trade routes and financial interests.
It's like watching two rival intelligence agencies fighting a massive proxy war over global influence and finance, using theology as the battlefield.
It really is. And it's vital to remember, as we synthesize this material, that ideologies, whether they lean left or right, religious or secular, are frequently adapted and weaponized by those in power to justify the status quo.
The label changes, but the goal is the same.
Exactly. The theology changes, the political rhetoric shifts, but the underlying goal remains the same: consolidating control over global resources. The source argues that the Enlightenment took this a step further by effectively displacing God from daily life altogether, making the invisible hand of the market itself the new sacred force.
So what does this all mean? We have the psychological control mechanisms of trauma and conformity, we have transnational trade networks pioneered by Venice, and we have the religious justification for endless wealth accumulation forged by the Dutch. What is the final piece of the architecture? Because you can't rely on literal pirate ships or religious wars forever.
No, you can't. The final step is institutionalizing the game. The oligarchs needed to move their wealth from physical, vulnerable trade ships on the ocean to untouchable, centralized financial institutions.
Enter the central banks.
Exactly. They entered the era of central banks. The source traces how the center of oligarchic power deliberately moved from the vulnerable Dutch Republic, which was geographically exposed to land invasions, to the relative safety of an island England.
So in 1688, we see the Glorious Revolution. But the text reframes this completely. It wasn't just a political revolution. It was basically a corporate merger.
That's a great way to put it.
Transnational elites essentially installed a Dutch aristocrat, William of Orange, as the King of England, specifically to protect and expand their capital networks.
And shortly after, in 1694, they created the ultimate financial engine to secure that capital, the Bank of England. The structure of this bank was a masterclass in risk management for the elite.
How did it work?
Well, it was a privately owned bank, but its loans are guaranteed by the parliament, meaning it was backed by the state's power to tax its citizens. Anyone with capital could invest in it, even Dutch rivals or the Catholic Church.
Okay, let me make sure I'm translating this right. The bank lent money to the government to finance wars. The profits from the interest on those loans went directly into the pockets of the private investors.
Yes.
But if a war was lost or the debt couldn't be repaid, the public, through taxation and the state guarantee, absorbed all the losses.
That is exactly how it worked.
It's like inventing a casino, where the private owners take all the winnings, but if the house happens to lose a hand, they just reach into the taxpayers' wallets to cover the bet.
It's wild, isn't it? And this raises an important question about the illusion of democratic control over finance, because this incredibly effective blueprint didn't just stay in England. The source explains how this exact institutional system transferred across the Atlantic to the United States, culminating in the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913.
The Federal Reserve, the absolute heart of the modern global economy, born out of secretive meetings on Jekyll Island.
Yeah. The source notes that the Federal Reserve operates on that exact same historical model refined in 1694. It is an entity deeply influenced by private banking interests, and the text explicitly links this enduring network to Masonic influence that has the extraordinary power to print money and lend it to the government with interest.
Leaving the public largely out of the loop.
Right. The control of capital, the absolute lifeblood of the nation, remains highly centralized and largely insulated from the hands of the voting public.
And this is where the whole journey we've taken today clicks into place for you, the listener. We started by talking about the deep, ancient desire for absolute order, the mythological, devouring energy of Saturn.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We saw how human psychology can be manipulated through trauma and group conformity to create unbreakable loyalty, whether you're a Spartan soldier or an assassin. We watched that control scale up through the swamps of Venice and the trading ships of the Dutch Republic, weaponizing religious anxiety to justify extreme wealth. And finally, it gets locked into place with central banking.
The architecture of power evolved from the crude physical violence of the ancient world into something invisible, institutional, and infinitely more powerful. The trauma and the conformity are no longer enforced by physical abuse or hallucinogens. They are enforced by a ubiquitous financial system that dictates the basic survival of every citizen.
Because if you don't play along with the modern economic system, you don't eat. It's the ultimate inescapable dependency. Trying to keep up with the daily news cycle can feel incredibly overwhelming, like you're drowning in a flood of disconnected, chaotic information.
Oh, absolutely.
But having these historical through lines, understanding why the institutional system was built the way it was, and the psychological levers it relies on, it protects you. It gives you a lens to see the hidden foundation, instead of just staring confused at the visible structure.
And speaking of that foundation, there's a lingering thought derived from the source material that we should leave you with to mull over.
Let's hear it.
We mentioned earlier that the source defines banking as extracting resources from the future.
Right. A really profound way to look at it.
Well, our entire modern global economy is currently built on a mountain of massive, unprecedented fiat debt. Debt is, by definition, borrowing from a future that hasn't happened yet. Which begs the question, are we, the modern public, functioning exactly like the subjects in the Solomon Asch experiment?
Oh, wow. I see where you're going with this.
Are we all just sitting in a global room, conforming to a collective illusion of immense wealth, absolutely terrified to be the one person to stand up and admit out loud that the line we are looking at, this massive extraction from a future we cannot possibly guarantee, doesn't actually match reality?
That is a chilling thought to end on. If the foundation is built on an illusion, we are all too afraid to question. What happens to the whole structure when someone finally breaks conformity? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you, keep looking for the invisible foundations, and we will see you next time.